The wheels of the chair caught on the doorframe, and for a moment Marin Ellis thought the whole diner had turned to look at her. Her hands gripped the metal rims tighter than they needed to. It was already too loud inside. Plates clinking, voices overlapping, a radio playing somewhere near the counter. She had picked the busiest hour on purpose, telling herself that if she came when the place was full, no one would have time to stare. She was wrong. There was always time to stare. It was the anniversary of the crash. 3 years since the truck ran the light, and everything below her waist stopped listening to her. She did not need a calendar to remind her. Her body remembered the date before her mind did, in the ache that settled into her shoulders, in the tightness behind her ribs that had nothing to do with her spine, and everything to do with memory. The diner, called the Blue Spoon, was the one place she still forced herself to visit. She used to sit in the same booth every Tuesday morning before the accident, back when she wore scrubs and carried a stethoscope instead of a folded blanket over her knees. Today, every table was taken. Every booth, every stool, every inch of counter space. She wheeled toward her usual spot near the window, the only table with a single empty chair across from her, and told herself she would eat quickly and leave before the lunch crowd made it worse. That was when the door opened again, and the noise dropped just slightly, the way it does when someone unexpected walks into a room. He was tall, with a straight back that looked like it had been trained into him rather than born with him, and a slight drag in his right leg that he tried to hide and could not quite manage. A dog walked beside him, a lean, alert German shepherd with a service vest buckled across its chest. The man's eyes moved across the room the way a person scans a place for exits, quick and practiced, before settling back to something almost embarrassed. There was nowhere to sit. Lena Ford, who had owned the Blue Spoon for 11 years and knew every regular by name, called out an apology from behind the counter, telling him it would be a few minutes before something opened up. He nodded, polite, and started to turn toward the door, ready to wait outside in the cold rather than stand awkwardly in the middle of a full room. Then his eyes landed on the empty chair across from Marin. He hesitated. She could see the hesitation clearly, the kind that came from knowing exactly what it looked like to sit down across from a stranger in a wheelchair, and not wanting to seem like he was doing her a favor, or worse, expecting one from her. Marin had seen that same look 100 times since the accident. People either avoided her completely, or overcorrected with a kindness so loud it made her feel like an exhibit. He walked over anyway. "Can I sit here?" he asked. His voice was low, even, the kind of voice used to giving instructions that mattered. He did not smile the way people smiled when they felt sorry for her. He simply asked, the same way he might have asked anyone else in that diner. Marin studied him for a second longer than politeness allowed. She noticed the small scar above his eyebrow, the tension in his jaw, the careful way he held his right leg, as if it cost him something to stand straight. She noticed his dog, too, sitting perfectly still by his side, ears up, eyes calm but working. "Sure," she said, and moved her tray slightly to make room. He thanked her and lowered himself into the chair with more care than the motion should have required. The dog settled beside him, and for a moment, everything in the diner returned to its normal rhythm. Forks against plates, the hiss of the coffee machine, someone laughing near the door. Marin went back to her coffee, grateful the moment had passed without becoming a scene. She did not expect conversation, and he did not offer any right away, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted out loud. Silence, when it was not pity, could feel like the kindest thing a stranger could give her. She was halfway through her eggs when the dog moved. It did not whimper or bark or paw at its handler's leg the way service dogs sometimes did when they wanted attention. It simply stood, walked around the edge of the table, and sat down directly in front of Marin's wheelchair. Then it rested its head gently against her knee and looked up at her with an expression so calm and so deliberate that for a moment she forgot to breathe. The diner noticed. Conversations near their table faded. Lena stopped mid-pour behind the counter. Even Curtis, a retired mechanic who ate at the same stool every single morning and rarely looked up from his newspaper, lowered the pages to watch. The man across from her went very still. "Duke," he said quietly, more surprised than commanding. "Duke, come here." The dog did not move. He stayed exactly where he was, his head resting against Marin's knee, his eyes steady on her face, as if he were reading something written there that no one else in the room could see. "I'm sorry," the man said, leaning forward slightly, his voice carrying an apology that seemed to run deeper than the moment required. "He doesn't do this. He's never done this. Not once. Not with anyone who isn't." He stopped himself, unsure how to finish the sentence without sounding strange. Maren looked down at the dog, at the steady weight of his head against her leg, and felt something loosen in her chest that she had been holding tight for 3 years. She had not realized how long it had been since anything had approached her without hesitation, without that careful, practiced gentleness people used when they were afraid of hurting her, or simply afraid. "It's all right," she said, and her voice came out softer than she meant it to. "I don't mind." The man watched his dog with an expression that mixed confusion and something like recognition, as if he had seen this exact stillness before, in another place, with another person, and the memory of it mattered more than he was ready to explain to a stranger over breakfast. "I'm Jacob," he said finally, extending a hand across the table. "Jacob Reyes. And apparently, this is Duke's table now." Maren almost laughed, the sound catching her off guard. "Maren Ellis," she said, shaking his hand. Her grip was firm, steadier than her circumstances might have suggested, and he noticed it, the same way she had noticed the discipline in his posture. Duke did not move from her knee. If anything, he pressed a little closer, as though he had found exactly what he had been searching the room for the moment he walked in. Around them, the diner slowly returned to its normal noise, plates clinking, the radio humming low, Lena resuming her pour behind the counter. But something had shifted at that one small table by the window, something neither Maren nor Jacob could yet name, and neither of them, in that moment, tried to explain it away. Maren reached down without thinking and rested her hand lightly on the dog's head. Duke's tail moved once against the floor, slow and certain, as if answering a question no one had asked out loud. Jacob watched the two of them, the woman who had flinched at the sound of the door earlier, and the animal who never approached anyone uninvited. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something other than the tight, watchful readiness that had followed him home from every deployment. He felt, oddly, like he had walked into the right room at exactly the right time. Neither of them spoke for a while. They did not need to. The diner carried on around them, unaware that something quiet and important had just taken root at a small table by the window, between a woman who had lost the version of herself she once knew, a man who was still learning how to live outside of danger, and a dog who seemed to understand both of them better than they understood themselves. Outside, the morning traffic moved past the window in its usual hurry, cars and buses and people rushing toward wherever they were expected to be. Inside the Blue Spoon, none of that urgency touched their table. Maren finished her coffee slower than she had planned. Jacob ordered eggs he had not intended to eat before finding a seat, and Duke stayed exactly where he was, curled loyally against a stranger's knee, as if he had already decided that this was not the end of something, but the beginning. Maren did not expect to see Jacob again. Strangers who shared a table because the diner was full rarely became more than a forgotten face, a name attached to one strange morning. But the following Tuesday, when she wheeled through the same door at the same hour, she found him already seated in the same booth, Duke, resting quietly beneath the table, with his chin on his paws. He looked up when the bell above the door rang, and something in his expression told her he had been hoping she would come. "I saved you a seat," he said, nodding toward the empty side of the booth. Duke insisted. Maren felt a small, unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest, the kind she had not let herself feel in a long time. She wheeled over and settled across from him, and Duke lifted his head just enough to acknowledge her before resting it again, content simply to know she was near. "Does he do this with everyone?" she asked, unwrapping her napkin. "Choose people, I mean." Jacob shook his head slowly. "No. He's trained to stay with me, unless I give him a specific command. What he did last week, walking over to you on his own, sitting like that, resting his head on you without being asked, that's not something they teach. That's something he decided. Maybe he just liked me." "Maybe," Jacob said, though his tone suggested he believed it was more complicated than that. "He's done it once before, a long time ago, with someone I served with." Maren waited, sensing there was more to the story, but not wanting to push. She had learned, through years of nursing before her accident, that people revealed their histories at their own pace, and forcing the timeline rarely helped anyone. Instead, she asked about him, not his past, not yet, but simple things. Where he grew up, how long he had lived in town, why he chose the Blue Spoon of all the diners along the main street. He answered easily enough, describing a childhood spent near the coast, a father who fixed boats for a living, a mother who taught elementary school and always smelled faintly of chalk dust. He had joined the Navy at 19, chasing something he could not quite name at the time, a need to prove himself useful in a way that mattered beyond the small town he had grown up in. And now? Maren asked. What does useful look like now? Jacob's jaw tightened slightly, the same way it had the first morning she met him. I'm still figuring that part out. She recognized the answer, because it was the same one she gave herself most days. Over the following weeks, their Tuesday mornings became something neither of them planned but both of them protected. Maren found herself waking earlier on those days, taking more care with her hair, though she told herself it had nothing to do with Jacob, and everything to do with simply feeling human again. Jacob, for his part, began arriving before the breakfast rush, claiming the same booth each time, saving the seat across from him without needing to say so out loud anymore. Lena noticed, the way diner owners tend to notice everything that happens beneath their roof. She started bringing their coffee without being asked, refilling it a little more often than she refilled anyone else's, and saying nothing about it beyond a knowing smile that neither of them acknowledged directly. It was on the fourth Tuesday that Maren finally asked the question she had been holding back since that first morning. What happened to your leg? Jacob did not flinch, though she noticed the slight pause before he answered, the kind of pause that came from deciding how much truth a stranger deserved. An operation that didn't go the way it was supposed to, he said carefully. Overseas. I don't talk about the details much. Not because I'm ashamed of them, but because most people don't know what to do with them once they hear them. They either go quiet, like I've handed them something too heavy to carry, or they get this look, like they're waiting for me to say something brave. Maren understood that better than most people could. People do the same thing with my chair, she said. They either look away completely, like I might be contagious, or they lean in too close, talking slower, like the accident took my hearing along with my legs. Jacob almost laughed, though there was no humor in it, only recognition. So we're both tired of being handled. Something like that. For the first time since they had met, the conversation between them stopped feeling like careful footsteps around a hidden wound, and started feeling like two people finally speaking the same language. She told him about the crash, though not all of it, not yet. She told him she had been a nurse, one of the good ones, the kind who stayed late without complaint, and remembered the names of every patient's family members. She told him about the truck that ran the light, about waking up in a hospital bed on the other side of the counter she used to work behind, about learning that some sentences, once spoken by a doctor, cannot be unheard no matter how many times you ask them to repeat it differently. Jacob listened without interrupting, the same steady attention he probably once gave to briefings that decided whether people lived or did not. When she finished, he did not offer sympathy, and she was grateful for that. He simply nodded, the way one professional acknowledges another's loss, understanding that some things did not need softening to be respected. You went from saving people, he said quietly, to needing people to save you. That's a hard trade. It's not a trade I agreed to, Maren said. It happened to me. I know. That's what makes it harder. Duke, sensing the shift in the air above him, lifted his head and rested it once again against her knee, the same gesture from that very first morning, steady and deliberate, as if reminding both of them that comfort did not always need words. Their conversations deepened after that, though never all at once. Maren learned that Jacob's service had ended after his injury, that he had spent nearly a year in recovery learning to walk again, with a leg that would never move quite the way it used to. She learned that Duke had come into his life during that recovery, trained not just to alert him to changes in his body, but to notice things Jacob himself sometimes missed. The racing heartbeat before a memory surfaced uninvited, the tension building in his shoulders before he even realized he was bracing for something that was not actually happening. Jacob in turn learned that Marin's recovery had been its own kind of battlefield, filled with therapists and specialists and long nights convincing herself that a body which no longer worked the way it once did was still a body worth living inside of. He learned that she had stopped visiting her old hospital entirely, unable to walk, or rather wheel, past the emergency room doors without feeling the old ache of belonging to a world that no longer had a place set aside for her. "Do you miss it?" he asked one morning, watching her stir sugar into coffee she did not particularly need sweetened. "Every single day," she admitted. "Not the hours, not the exhaustion. I miss being needed in a way that mattered. I miss walking into a room and knowing exactly what to do to make things better. Now I walk into rooms, well, wheel into rooms, and people just see what's wrong with me." "I don't," Jacob said simply. Marin looked up at him, surprised by the plainness of it, the lack of performance in the statement. He was not trying to flatter her or fix her. He was simply telling her something true, the way he might report weather conditions or confirm coordinates. "What do you see then?" she asked. He considered the question longer than she expected. "Someone who still knows exactly what to do to make things better. You just haven't found the room yet." The words settled into her in a way few things had since the accident, quiet and true, the kind of sentence she would return to later, alone in her apartment, turning it over like a stone worn smooth by handling. Weeks passed, and their Tuesday breakfasts became something closer to an anchor for both of them, a fixed point neither wanted to lose. Marin began noticing small changes in herself, a straighter posture, a readiness to laugh that had been missing since before the accident, a willingness to look people in the eye instead of scanning the room first to see who was staring at her chair. Jacob changed too, though more slowly, more carefully. He talked more. He allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could measure, to sit in a public place without positioning himself to watch every entrance and exit. Duke seemed to notice this shift as well, relaxing beside Marin's chair, with an ease that suggested even the dog understood something important was taking shape at that small table by the window. One morning, Curtis, the retired mechanic who had watched that very first encounter unfold over his newspaper, leaned over from his stool at the counter. "You two been coming here a lot," he said, not quite a question. "We have," Jacob answered, glancing at Marin. "Good," Curtis said simply, returning to his paper, as if that single word settled something that had needed settling for a long time. Marin smiled at the exchange, feeling, for the first time in years, like a regular, in a place that had once only reminded her of everything she used to be. The Blue Spoon, once just a habit she forced herself into on the anniversary of her worst day, had slowly become something else entirely, a place where a dog had chosen her without hesitation, where a stranger had asked to sit without pity, and where, week by week, she was beginning to remember what it felt like to be seen as a whole person again, instead of a collection of things that no longer worked. Neither of them spoke about what was growing between them directly, not yet. It was too new, too fragile, built on foundations neither wanted to disturb by naming too soon, but it was there, unmistakable, in the way Jacob always arrived early to save her seat, in the way Marin found herself looking forward to Tuesdays the way she once looked forward to good shifts at the hospital, and in the steady, quiet presence of a dog who had somehow known, before either of them did, that these two people belonged at the same table. It happened on a Thursday, not their usual Tuesday, which was part of why it caught Marin so off guard. She had come into town for a physical therapy appointment and stopped by the Blue Spoon afterward out of habit, not expecting to see Jacob there at all. But he was, sitting near the back with Duke stretched out beside him, and the sight of him eased something in her chest before she had even crossed the room. She was 3 tables away when the noise started. A group of teenagers near the entrance had been horsing around, and one of them knocked into a rack of metal trays stacked by the counter. The trays crashed to the floor in a sudden, violent clatter, sharp and loud, the sound bouncing off the walls of the small diner, like something breaking apart. Marin froze. It was not the sound itself that stopped her, not exactly. It was the memory the sound dragged up with it, uninvited and merciless, the screech of metal against metal from 3 years ago, the moment before everything in her life split into before and after. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles turned pale. Her breathing came fast and shallow, her vision narrowing at the edges, her heart slamming against her ribs as if trying to escape the moment entirely. She could hear voices around her, distant and warped, as though she were underwater. Someone was asking if she was all right. She could not answer. She could not even locate where the voice was coming from. Then she felt it, a weight settling against her leg, steady and familiar. Duke had crossed the diner in seconds, moving with the same quiet certainty he had shown that very first morning. He pressed his body against her knee, solid and warm, and rested his head in her lap, looking up at her with those same calm, steady eyes. He did not bark or paw or demand her attention. He simply stayed, patient and unwavering, a small anchor in a moment that had begun spinning out of her control. Jacob was there a second later, kneeling in front of her chair so that his eyes were level with hers, his voice low and even, the same voice he must have used in moments far more dangerous than a stack of fallen trays. "You're at the Blue Spoon," he said quietly. "It's Thursday. You're safe. I'm right here." Maren focused on his voice, on the weight of Duke against her leg, on the specific, ordinary details Jacob offered her, the name of the diner, the day of the week, the fact of his presence. Slowly, her breathing began to even out. The narrowing at the edges of her vision widened again, the diner returning to its normal shape and color around her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, once she could speak again, embarrassed by the small crowd that had gathered without her noticing. "Don't be," Jacob said firmly. "You don't apologize for what your body remembers." Lena had already ushered the teenagers into an apology and cleared the fallen trays, quietly asking the other customers to give Maren some space. Duke stayed pressed against her leg the entire time, unmoving, as steady as a promise. When they were finally alone again, Jacob still kneeling in front of her chair, Maren let out a shaky breath. "That hasn't happened in months," she admitted. "I thought I was past it." "You're not past it," Jacob said gently. "You're just further along than you were." "Those aren't the same thing." She studied him, struck again by how precisely he understood the difference, the same distinction her therapists had tried to explain to her a dozen times without it ever landing the way it landed now, coming from someone who clearly carried his own version of the same weight. "Does this happen to you?" she asked. "The freezing, the way everything gets loud and far away at the same time." Jacob nodded slowly, finally sitting back into the chair across from her instead of kneeling. "More than I'd like to admit. Mine usually comes from sudden movement, or certain smells, or silence that goes on too long in a place that should be noisy. Duke was trained to notice the signs before I do. My heartbeat changes, my shoulders tighten. He presses against me the same way he just did with you, before I even realize what's building." "Is that what happened last week, when he first came to my table?" Jacob's expression shifted, something thoughtful crossing his face. "I've thought about that a lot," he admitted. "I don't think he was responding to something happening in that moment. I think he noticed something in how you were holding yourself, the tension in your shoulders, the way you grip the wheels tighter than the motion required. He's been trained to notice bodies that are bracing for something, even when the person doesn't realize they're doing it." Maren absorbed that slowly, thinking back to that first morning, the anniversary of the crash, the tightness she had carried into the diner without naming it even to herself. She had assumed she was hiding it well. Apparently, she had not been hiding it from Duke at all. "He noticed something about me before I let myself notice it," she said quietly. "Sounds like him," Jacob said, a small, tired smile crossing his face. "He noticed something about me once too, a long time before I was ready to talk about any of it." Maren looked at him, sensing the door he had left slightly open. "Tell me," she said softly, an invitation rather than a demand. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on Duke's back, fingers moving slowly through the dog's fur. "There was someone I served with," he began. "Danny Ortiz. We came up through training together, deployed together more than once. He was the kind of person who made hard days feel manageable, just by being there, always the first one to make a joke when everyone else had run out of things to say." He paused, choosing his words carefully, the way someone does when a memory still carries weight even years later. After a mission that didn't go the way any of us expected, Danny came home different, quieter. He stopped answering messages the way he used to. None of us realized how much he was struggling, because he was so good at hiding it, at being the same steady person we all needed him to be. "What happened?" Marin asked gently. Duke was still new to me at the time, still learning my patterns. But one evening Danny came by my place, and the second he walked through the door, Duke got up and went straight to him, the exact same way he came to you, sat in front of him, rested his head against his leg, wouldn't move. And, at the time, I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much more of it. A few weeks later, Danny was finally diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress, something none of us had caught, something he had been careful to hide, even from the people who loved him most. Looking back, I think Duke noticed what the rest of us missed, the tension he was carrying, the bracing, the exhaustion of holding himself together in front of everyone. Marin felt something settle heavily in her chest, a mixture of sorrow for a man she had never met, and quiet awe at the animal now resting calmly against her leg. "Is Danny all right now?" "He's better," Jacob said. "It took time, and it took people finally noticing what needed noticing. He still struggles some days, but he's building a life again, same as us." "Same as us," Marin repeated softly, the words carrying more truth than either of them had spoken aloud before that afternoon. They sat together for a long while after that, neither of them in a hurry to leave, the diner slowly returning to its ordinary rhythm around them. Marin found herself studying Duke with new appreciation, understanding now that his stillness was not simple affection, but something closer to attentiveness, a kind of quiet expertise built through patience and training, and, perhaps, something instinctive that no training alone could fully explain. "Thank you," she said eventually, looking at Jacob, "for staying, for talking me through it instead of just watching." "I know what it looks like from the inside," Jacob said simply. "I wasn't going to leave you there alone in it." The words carried a weight that neither of them acknowledged directly, though both felt it settle into the space between them, something steady and dependable taking root, where before, there had only been two strangers sharing a table out of necessity. Before she left that afternoon, Marin reached down and rested her palm against the side of Duke's face, the dog leaning gently into her touch. "You noticed something in me before I was ready to admit it myself," she murmured. "I suppose I owe you for that." Duke's tail thumped once against the floor, slow and certain, the same answer he always gave, the only answer he ever needed to give. Jacob watched the two of them together, and something in his chest loosened that he had not expected. He had spent years learning to notice danger before it arrived, trained to anticipate threats in every room he entered. It occurred to him now that Duke had been doing something similar all along, except instead of watching for danger, he had been watching for people who needed to be found, and somehow, without either of them fully understanding how, he had found exactly the person Jacob needed too. Autumn moved into the town quickly that year, stripping the trees along the main street bare within a matter of weeks. Marin barely noticed the change, too caught up in the rhythm her life had taken on since meeting Jacob and Duke, a rhythm built around Tuesday mornings, and, increasingly, other days scattered through the week as well. What began as a chance encounter over a crowded diner had grown into something neither of them rushed to define, though both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that it had become essential. It was on an ordinary Wednesday, the diner filled with its usual late-morning crowd, when everything changed in the space of a few seconds. Gerald Combs was a heavy-set man in his 60s, who came in most mornings for black coffee and a slice of pie he insisted on calling breakfast. He sat 2 tables down from Marin and Jacob, exchanging his usual nod of greeting when he arrived, settling into his booth with the newspaper folded under one arm. He was halfway through his coffee when he made a strange, choking sound, his hand flying to his chest, his face draining of color in an instant. The fork slipped from his fingers and clattered against his plate. For a heartbeat, no one in the diner reacted, the way people often freeze when something unthinkable interrupts an ordinary morning. Then Gerald slumped sideways in the booth, his breathing turning ragged and shallow, and the diner erupted into panic, chairs scraping back, voices rising in alarm, someone shouting for anyone who knew what to do. Marin was moving before she had time to think about it. Years of instinct, buried but never truly gone, surged forward the moment she saw him collapse. She wheeled toward his booth with a speed that startled even herself, calling out instructions in a voice that carried clearly over the rising panic around her. "Someone call for emergency help now," she said, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. "Tell them a man in his 60s, chest pain, difficulty breathing, possible cardiac event." Lena grabbed the phone from behind the counter immediately, dialing with shaking hands, while Marin maneuvered as close to Gerald's booth as her chair would allow. "I need him on the floor, flat now," she said, and Jacob was already there, lifting Gerald carefully from the booth with the practiced strength of someone trained to move injured people quickly and safely, lowering him onto the open space near the window. Marin wheeled forward until she was beside him, positioning herself as close to his level as her chair would allow, her fingers finding his wrist, checking his pulse with the same steady precision she had used 1,000 times before the accident took that world away from her. "Gerald, can you hear me?" she said firmly, leaning close to his face. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and afraid. "Chest," he managed to gasp. "Hurts." "I know," Marin said, her voice calm despite the racing of her own heart. "You're having a heart episode. Help is coming. I need you to stay as still as you can and breathe with me, all right?" She guided him through slow, measured breaths, counting aloud, her hand resting against his shoulder to keep him steady. Jacob knelt on his other side, following her instructions without question, positioning Gerald's legs to help circulation, keeping his airway clear, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone used to responding in moments when panic was not an option. "Does he have any medication on him?" Marin asked, glancing at Jacob. "Check his jacket pockets." Jacob searched quickly and found a small orange bottle, reading the label aloud. Marin recognized the medication instantly and nodded. "Give him one, under the tongue, not swallowed." Jacob followed the instruction precisely, placing the small tablet exactly where she directed. Gerald's breathing remained ragged, but he held on, his eyes locked onto Marin's face, as though her steady presence alone was keeping him tethered to consciousness. Around them, the diner had gone eerily quiet, the earlier panic settling into a hushed, watchful stillness, as customers and staff alike stood back, giving them room, some with hands pressed to their mouths, others simply staring in stunned silence at the woman in the wheelchair who had transformed, in the space of a few seconds, into the calmest and most capable person in the room. Duke had positioned himself a few feet away, sitting perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with the same quiet vigilance he showed in every moment that mattered, as though he understood that his role in this particular emergency was simply to stay out of the way and let the people who knew what to do continue doing it. Minutes passed like hours, Marin continuing to monitor Gerald's pulse and breathing, speaking to him steadily, keeping him calm and conscious, refusing to let her focus waver even as her own hands trembled slightly with the effort of holding everything together. Jacob stayed close beside her, following her lead without hesitation, his presence a steady support she leaned on without needing to ask. When the sound of sirens finally became audible outside, growing louder as they approached, Marin felt the tight knot in her chest loosen slightly, though she did not stop her work until the paramedics burst through the door and knelt beside them, taking over with practiced speed. She gave them a clear, precise report, the kind she used to deliver 100 times a week in the emergency room she once called home, detailing Gerald's symptoms, the medication administered, his current pulse and breathing rate, every detail sharp and useful, the language of her old life returning to her lips, as though it had never left. The paramedics worked quickly, loading Gerald onto a stretcher, one of them pausing to look at Marin with open admiration. "Good work," he said simply. "Whatever you did before we got here, it probably saved him some serious trouble." "I used to work in an emergency room," Marin said, her voice quieter now that the urgency had passed, the adrenaline beginning to drain from her system all at once, leaving her hands shaking and her breath uneven. "Well, it shows," the paramedic said, before turning back to his patient and wheeling Gerald out through the door, the sirens rising again as the ambulance pulled away from the curb. The diner remained silent for a long moment after the doors closed, the entire room seeming to exhale at once. Then, slowly, applause broke out, scattered at first before growing into something warm and full, customers and staff alike clapping for the woman who had, without a moment of hesitation, become exactly who she used to be. Maren sat frozen in the middle of the room, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, her hands still trembling slightly in her lap. Jacob knelt beside her chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, steadying her the same way she had steadied Gerald only minutes before. "You did that," he said quietly. "Just for her. All of it. That was you." Tears gathered in Maren's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, not from fear or sadness but from something she had almost forgotten how to feel. The pure, uncomplicated relief of being useful in exactly the way she used to be, before the accident had convinced her that version of herself was gone for good. "I thought I lost that," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought that part of me died with my legs." "It didn't," Jacob said firmly. "It was just waiting for the right room." The words echoed something he had told her weeks earlier, and this time, sitting in the middle of a diner that had just watched her save a man's life, she finally believed him. Duke moved closer, resting his head against her knee once more, the same gesture that had started everything between them weeks ago, steady and grounding, as if celebrating quietly in the only language he knew. Lena approached from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Maren," she said softly, "I've watched a lot of people come through those doors over the years. I don't think I've ever seen anything like what you just did." "I just did what I was trained to do," Maren said, though the words carried none of the deflection they might have carried weeks earlier. She said them now with something closer to pride. News of what happened at the Blue Spoon spread quickly through the small town over the following days, and Maren found herself, for the first time since the accident, recognized not for the wheelchair she sat in, but for the steady competence she had shown when it mattered most. People she had never met stopped her on the street to thank her, to tell her they had heard the story, to ask, cautiously, whether she had ever considered returning to some form of medical work. She had not seriously, not since the accident had convinced her that door was permanently closed. But sitting across from Jacob a few days later, Duke resting quietly beneath their table, she found herself turning the question over for the first time, without immediately dismissing it. "I can't work the way I used to," she said slowly, thinking aloud more than explaining. "I can't run down a hallway to a code, or lift a patient onto a bed the way I once did." "No," Jacob agreed, "but you just proved you can still assess a situation faster than anyone else in the room, and guide people through it with a clear head under pressure. That's not something a chair takes away from you." Maren looked at him for a long moment, something shifting quietly behind her eyes, the first real spark of possibility she had allowed herself to feel in 3 long years. "Maybe there's a different room for me," she said slowly, testing the idea the way one tests a bridge before crossing it. "Not the same one, a different one." "Maybe," Jacob said, a small, genuine smile crossing his face. "Duke and I happen to know a thing or two about finding new rooms when the old ones close." Duke lifted his head at the sound of his name, glancing between the two of them as if he understood, in his own quiet way, that something important had just been decided. Winter came early that year, dusting the town in a light frost that clung to the windows of the Blue Spoon each morning. Maren no longer dreaded the changing seasons the way she once had, no longer measured them by the anniversary of a crash that had once defined every part of her calendar. Instead, she measured them by the steady, growing sense of purpose that had crept back into her days, one small step at a time, ever since the morning a stranger asked if he could sit at her table. The idea that began as a quiet conversation over coffee had grown, over the following weeks, into something concrete. Maren reached out to a rehabilitation center on the edge of town, a place that worked with veterans adjusting to life after injury, as well as civilians recovering from accidents that had changed the shape of their futures. She had expected hesitation, questions about what a nurse who could no longer walk could realistically offer patients, still learning to navigate wheelchairs and prosthetics and unfamiliar bodies. Instead, the director had listened to her story, the accident, the years of therapy, the recent afternoon at the diner when instinct and training had guided her through a stranger's medical emergency, without a moment of doubt, and offered her a position on the spot, one built specifically around what she could offer rather than what she could no longer do. Maren began volunteering there twice a week, Her role focused on counseling patients newly adjusting to life with permanent injuries, sharing not medical instructions delivered from behind a clipboard but lived experience, the kind no textbook could teach. She sat with young men and women learning to grip a wheelchair's wheels for the first time, telling them honestly about the anger she had felt, the grief, the long nights convincing herself that a changed body was still a body worth living inside of. She did not offer false comfort or empty encouragement. She offered truth, earned the hard way, and it mattered more to her patients than any amount of polished sympathy ever could have. Jacob joined her there most weeks as well, speaking with veterans still adjusting to injuries of their own, some visible, some hidden, entirely beneath a steady exterior, the way his own had once been. Duke came too, moving quietly between patients with the same instinctive attentiveness he had shown from that very first morning at the diner, resting his head against the knee of whoever in the room seemed to need it most, offering comfort that required no explanation and no permission. One afternoon, a young man named Owen Whitfield, recently discharged after an accident that had cost him the full use of his left arm, sat quietly in a corner of the rehabilitation center's common room, refusing to join the group conversation forming around him. Maren wheeled over without hesitation, recognizing in his silence the same isolation she had once carried into every room she entered after her own accident. "You don't have to talk," she told him gently, settling beside him. "I remember what it's like to feel like nobody in the room understands what happened to you." Owen looked at her, surprised by the directness, the lack of forced cheerfulness in her voice. "Everyone keeps telling me it gets easier," he said quietly. "I don't believe them." "It doesn't get easier," Maren said honestly. "It gets different. You get stronger at carrying it, but the weight doesn't disappear. Anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't carried something like this themselves." Something in Owen's shoulders loosened at the honesty, the first real conversation he had allowed himself since arriving at the center. Duke, sensing the shift, moved quietly across the room and settled beside him, resting his head against his good arm, patient and unhurried. Owen looked down at the dog, startled. "Does he do this with everyone?" Maren smiled, the same question she herself had once asked Jacob months earlier, back when she had been the stranger receiving Duke's quiet, unexplainable attention. "No," she said. "He's very particular about who he chooses." The blue spoon remained a fixture in both their lives, even as their world expanded beyond it. The diner that had once been the site of Maren's most painful anniversary transforming, slowly and completely, into the place where everything good in her life had begun. Lena kept their booth by the window reserved most Tuesday mornings without needing to be asked, and Curtis, still faithful to his stool and his newspaper, greeted them each week with the same simple nod of approval he had offered from the very beginning. Gerald Combs, fully recovered from his heart episode, returned to the diner within a month, walking through the door with a slower, more careful gait, but a wide, grateful smile aimed directly at Maren's table. He made a habit from that day forward of stopping by whenever he saw her there, thanking her again each time as though the debt could never quite be repaid, though Maren always waved it away with the same quiet insistence that she had simply done what needed doing. Months turned into a full year, and the Blue Spoon Diner witnessed, quietly and without fanfare, the slow unfolding of two lives that had once felt broken beyond repair, rebuilding themselves, not despite what they had lost, but because of what they had learned to carry afterward. On a bright, crisp Tuesday morning, nearly 13 months after that first fateful question, Jacob arrived at their usual booth, to find Maren already there, a folder resting on the table in front of her. Duke settled immediately at her feet, the familiar weight of his presence as natural now as breathing. "What's this?" Jacob asked, sliding into his seat. "An offer," Maren said, sliding the folder toward him. "A full-time counseling position at the rehabilitation center. They want to build an entire program around what I've been doing, working with new patients, veterans, and civilians both, helping them adjust in those first difficult months." Jacob read through the papers slowly, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his face. "This is everything you said you missed," he said quietly. "Being needed, making a real difference." "It is," Maren said, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide from him. "I never thought I'd get this back. Not like this." Jacob reached across the table and took her hand, an easy, natural gesture that had become as familiar to both of them as their Tuesday mornings. "You didn't get it back," he said gently. "You built something new, something that couldn't have existed without everything you went through first." Maren looked down at Duke, resting peacefully beneath their table, his steady presence woven so completely into the fabric of her recovery that she could no longer imagine the shape her life would have taken without him. She thought back to that first frozen morning, the crowded diner, the stranger who had simply asked to sit down, the dog who had crossed the room without hesitation, and changed the direction of two lives that had both, in their own separate ways, been quietly searching for a place to land. "Thank you," she said softly, looking between Jacob and the dog resting calmly at her feet, "for asking if you could sit here." Jacob squeezed her hand gently, his eyes warm with something steady and certain. "Thank Duke," he said. He knew before either of us did. Outside the window, the town moved through its ordinary morning, cars passing, people hurrying toward wherever they needed to be, unaware of the quiet, remarkable story that had taken root at one small table by the window of the Blue Spoon Diner. Inside, Maren Ellis and Jacob Reyes sat together as they had every Tuesday for over a year, two people who had once believed the most important parts of themselves were gone for good, now living proof that some losses, however devastating, could eventually make room for something neither of them could have found on their own. Duke lay quietly between their chairs, content and unhurried, exactly where he had decided, from that very first morning, that he belonged.